All right, everybody, welcome on in. Thank you for joining us tonight on this what has been for us a very unseasonably warm Thursday night. Tonight we get to really dive into a different period of history than we sometimes do here at Montpelier. But Hilarie's gonna inform us a little bit about the DuPont family and what they're all about, and we're gonna get to look at some cool stuff. So I'm gonna turn it over to Hilarie and let her take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. And tell me if you are seeing the DuPonts, the Madisons, and Montpelier, the history of a remarkable chemistry, without any of my notes on it.
All good. I can see
it. Excellent. Let me find my place here. So I've titled this The DuPonts, the Madisons, and Montpelier, the history of a remarkable chemistry. And I'm sure you already know that the Madisons were the first owners of Montpelier. 3 generations of the Madison family owned the property from 1723 to 1844. And most of you probably know that the DuPonts were the last private owners of Montpelier. 2 generations of DuPonts owned the property from 1901 to 1983. So that means almost half a century separates the Madisons from the DuPonts at Montpelier. And you would think that their stories would be 2 very separate chapters in history, but they're not quite as separate as you might imagine. So tonight we're going to look at the way those 2 family stories are actually intertwined in some very intriguing ways. In part 1 of the presentation, we'll look at the origins of the DuPont family in America, going down the generations to find the Montpelier DuPonts, William Sr., his wife Annie, and their children Marian and William Jr. Excuse me. In part 2, we'll look through some old photos from the DuPont scrapbooks that show what the family's life was like at Montpelier. In part 3, we'll connect the Montpelier DuPonts with some other DuPont relatives whose names may be familiar to you. And in part 4, we'll conclude with some of my favorite unexpected connections between the Madisons and the DuPonts. So let's start with the big picture of the DuPont family. The first DuPont to come to America was Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, and I've highlighted him in red at the top of this chart. And don't worry if you can't read everything on the chart. I'm just using the chart from time to time to highlight some of the key players in our story so that you can see the generational relationships. And I apologize if your favorite DuPont is not on the chart. I had to leave out a lot of people. Otherwise, this genealogy would be big enough to paper a room. So here is Pierre. He was born in Paris in 1739. So he was just 12 years older than James Madison, basically contemporaries. Pierre was an economist, a printer, and a government official who somehow managed to anger people on both sides of the French Revolution. He got on the bad side of Louis XV by advocating low tariffs and free trade. He angered Louis XVI by criticizing Marie Antoinette's spending. After the Bastille fell, he became president of the French National Assembly, but he became disillusioned during the Reign of Terror. Pierre and his son, E.I. DuPont, tried to protect Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette when a mob attacked the Tuileries Palace in 1792. He was sentenced to the guillotine, but freed after Robespierre was executed. Pierre angered radical elements by advocating financial reform of the French government. After his home and print shop were burned, he fled to the U.S. in 1799, arriving here on January the 1st of 1800. He went back to France in 1802 and tried to resume his career. He helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. He supported Napoleon's exile and the reestablishment of Louis XVIII as king. When Napoleon returned in 1815 for what became his 100 days, Pierre returned to the U.S. Pierre's son, E.I., was operating a gunpowder mill in Delaware by this time, so that's where he went. And a fire broke out there in 1718. Pierre helped to fight it and actually died of exhaustion after fighting the fire. Pierre had two sons who also came to America, Victor Marie DuPont, who's in yellow there, and I always get tongue-tied when I try to say his name, but Eleuthère Irénée DuPont, who I prefer to call E.I. DuPont, is there in orange. So E.I. founded the chemical company while Victor pursued a career in government service and other business interests. Montpelier's DuPonts come from E.I.'s side of the family. So here's Victor, the elder son of Pierre. He had a government career in France and later in the U.S. In 1784, he worked with his father in Louis XVI's Bureau of Commerce. He came to the U.S. while serving under the French minister to the U.S. in 1788, 1792, and then returned to the U.S. as the French consul in Charleston in 1794-97. With all the turmoil in France, Victor sometimes went for months at a time without hearing from his father and brother. For example, he heard they were in prison, but he didn't initially hear when they had been released. And he described them as living, quote, where there are volcanoes under the feet and where revolutions engender revolutions. Victor helped his family emigrate to the U.S. in 1799. He had various business projects in the U.S. His trading company, Victor DuPont de Nemours and Company, went bankrupt. He tried farming in the Genesee Valley in New York. And then with his brother E.I. and with Peter Bawdy, he established a woolen mill across the river from E.I.'s powder mill. He became involved in state government soon after moving to Delaware, serving in both the state House and state Senate. And then here's Pierre's younger son, E.I., who would eventually start the company that we now know as DuPont. E.I. showed an early interest in gunpowder and even wrote a paper about it at age 14. He was mentored by the chemist Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, as you might remember from your high school chemistry class. By age 17, E.I. was working under Lavoisier at the Royal Gunpowder and Saltpeter Administration. Lavoisier was unfortunately executed at the beginning of the French Revolution, which I don't remember being mentioned in my high school chemistry class. E.I. supported the French Revolution along with his father Pierre, and they both became disillusioned. And E.I. was with his father trying to protect Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette from the mob at the Tuileries. As I mentioned before, they were imprisoned, sentenced to execution, pardoned, and finally fled to the U.S. in 1799. There's a story that may be apocryphal that E.I. was on a hunting trip and after encountering poor quality gunpowder, decided to establish his own gunpowder mill. But for whatever reason he decided to do it, he opened it in 1802 in Delaware under the name of E.I. DuPont de Nemours Gunpowder Company. He had a contract to provide black powder to the U.S. government in the War of 1812. And by the time of his death in 1834, the DuPont Company was producing over 1 million pounds of gunpowder annually. After his death, E.I.'s sons Alfred V. DuPont and Henry DuPont managed the company. So here we have E.I.'s sons. We've got Alfred V. DuPont in violet and boss Henry DuPont in blue. And we'll talk in a moment why he got that nickname. Alfred V. was only a year old when he emigrated to the U.S. with his father, E.I., his grandfather, Pierre, and the rest of their family. While he grew up around the gunpowder mill, he went down a more academic career path. He studied chemistry at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He befriended chemistry professor Thomas Cooper, who coincidentally also taught James Madison's nephew, Robert, at Dickinson College. When Cooper moved on from Dickinson to the University of Pennsylvania, Alfred became Cooper's assistant. But Alfred came back to Delaware to help his father, E.I., rebuild the family business after one of the most serious accidents in the history of the company, the Great Explosion of March 19, 1818, which killed 34 people and destroyed numerous buildings. Alfred worked as a powder man in the mills and also did lab work, researching new developments in gunpowder chemistry. He was made head of the company in a reorganization in 1837, but that was not really a natural role for him. Alfred opposed the Mexican-American War, but he refused to sell gunpowder to a buyer in Havana because he suspected the buyer would send it to the Mexican government. He explained, "However unjust our proceedings may be, and however shameful our invasion of Mexican territory, we cannot make powder to be used against our own country." In 1847, there was yet another major explosion at the mill, and Alfred spent his last years at the company bringing it back from that disaster, mirroring the start of his career after 1818's Great Explosion. So Alfred's younger brother, Henry, was the next to run the family business. Henry attended West Point and had a short military career during the Creek Indian Wars in 1833-34 before coming home to join the company. After his father E.I.'s death, Henry managed the company with Alfred and a brother-in-law, then ran it himself after Alfred retired. He was known to be diligent, authoritarian, uninterested in new methods, but aggressively expanded the business. Because you don't get the nickname Boss Henry by being easygoing. He called in old loans, built new mills, bought out competitors. After becoming Major General of the Delaware Volunteers in 1860, he required all employees to take a loyalty oath to the USA, and he canceled contracts with states that were threatening secession. After the Civil War, Henry expanded production to meet the needs of railroad companies who were using black powder as blasting powder. But the railroads eventually wanted improved blasting powder. Alfred's son, Lamont DuPont, Henry's nephew, pressed for the company to get into the field of high explosives like nitroglycerin and dynamite, which is a nitroglycerin mixture molded into sticks, as you can visualize from any Wile E. Coyote cartoon. Henry finally agreed, forming the Rapano Chemical Company, with nephew Lamont as its head and Henry's son, William DuPont Sr., as secretary-treasurer. So that's the William who eventually bought Montpelier. Tragically, Lamont was killed in a nitroglycerin explosion at Rapano in 1884. William Sr. then took over as president of Rapano. Boss Henry ran the DuPont company until his death in 1889, leaving its leadership to his two sons and two nephews. So here are Boss Henry's two sons, Henry Algernon DuPont and William DuPont Sr. The rivalry between the two sons was a story in itself, and indirectly led to William's eventual purchase of Montpelier. Henry A. was a Civil War veteran and was called the Colonel to distinguish him from his father, the General. Henry A.'s experience was with railroads rather than chemical processes. Henry A. expected to be senior partner because he was the oldest son. He was 17 years older than William. But William challenged him because William had actual experience running chemical companies. They worked out a compromise where Henry A. was nominally the president, Boss Henry's nephews ran the day-to-day operations in Delaware, and William stayed with the Rapano Chemical Company in New Jersey. The rivalry between the two brothers was bitter, however, and Henry A. looked for a reason to shut William out. And that reason became William's relationship with Annie Zinn. So William had initially married his distant cousin May, Mary Lamont DuPont, in 1887. So that's William on the right in green and May in blue on opposite sides of the family tree. So they were second cousins once removed. Pierre was their common ancestor. He was William's great-grandfather, May's great-great-grandfather. And it appears to have been a loveless arranged marriage. And the larger DuPont family would not have paid much attention if William had discreetly strayed. However, William became involved with Annie Rogers Zinn, a woman who was in the process of divorcing her unfaithful husband, General George Zinn. Now, he was a Civil War veteran. He was 16 years older than Annie, and they had 2 children. So it wasn't that there was anything wrong with Annie herself. Her social circle overlapped with the DuPonts. It wasn't that people were unsympathetic about Annie's husband being unfaithful. It was just that divorce wasn't done in that time and in that social class. Annie had been shunned by the DuPont family because of her impending divorce, even before the news broke that she was seeing William. Henry A. saw this scandal as a means to cut William out of the family business and social circle. Henry made a point of announcing to a group of family members that William was not only seeing this divorcee, but that William intended to divorce his wife, May, and marry Annie. And he did just that, over his family's objections, even though that meant he was frozen out of company leadership and Wilmington society. So Annie obtained her divorce from George Zinn in Delaware in November 1890. And as this January 1892 article from the Wilmington Evening Journal indicates, the rumor mill had been churning over the prospect of William obtaining a divorce. And the article refers to a property transfer that included William's Wilmington mansion, furnishings, adjacent lots, horses and carriages, transferred for $1 to Thomas F. Bayard, with no mention of May's name. The newspaper thought that this indicated that William had already obtained a divorce from May if he was disposing of property without his wife's participation. What was actually happening was that William was using the attorney Thomas Bayard as an intermediary to transfer the house to May as part of the impending divorce settlement. And the attorney, Thomas Bayard, incidentally, was the grandson of James A. Bayard, who was one of the peace commissioners appointed by James Madison to negotiate the Treaty of Ghent that ended the War of 1812. So as this newspaper article noted, the property transfer happened in Minnehaha County, South Dakota, where it was assumed that William had gone to get his divorce. Why South Dakota? South Dakota was the place to go to get a quickie divorce, or at least a relatively uncomplicated divorce, in the 1890s. Western states had pretty lenient residency requirements, and South Dakota had liberal divorce laws carried over from territorial law, including just a 90-day residence requirement and no requirements to serve a personal summons on the other spouse. It just had to be published in a South Dakota newspaper. So William sued for divorce in Minnehaha County, whose capital, Sioux Falls, had become known as a divorce colony. So you're seeing Sioux Falls here in one half of the stereoscope photo. Sioux Falls was located on the railroad. It had a judge who was sympathetic to divorce cases, and a number of hotels and businesses there catered to Eastern divorce seekers who would come and live in a hotel or boarding house for the 90 days it took to claim residency and then apply for their divorce. Now, in 1893, the year after William's divorce, some reforms were enacted. So at that point, it was required that the petitioner be a bona fide resident for 6 months and required that the other spouse receive a summons. But it was still simple when William went out there. But William didn't opt to just live in a hotel. He actually bought property in Elk Point, South Dakota, about 65 miles from Sioux Falls, a 215-acre farm with a 14-room house, 2 barns, and other outbuildings. And I'd like to thank John Fowler, an Elk Point native, for sharing some research with me, research he had done on the DuPonts in South Dakota. So the local paper in South Dakota had its own take on William DuPont's divorce, with the dramatic headline, "Has his millions, but his wife deserted him and he came to Sioux Falls for freedom." Now, the newspaper didn't have the story straight regarding William's first marriage, which it said was to a Southern lady who abruptly deserted him. But the account of William bringing his servants, horses, carriages, and dogs to South Carolina and bewildering the good people of Elk Point with his grandeur and munificence is kind of intriguing. We don't know why William decided to buy property in South Dakota. Maybe it seemed like a place where he and Annie could live quietly rather than face social ostracism in Delaware. After William obtained his divorce in January 1892, he and Annie were married at St. George's Church in London, England, on June the 1st, 1892. They then lived in Elk Point for a year or two. Interestingly, when the local Episcopal church in Elk Point burned to the ground, Annie offered to pay for it to be rebuilt, which suggests that the DuPonts were trying to be good members of their new community. The new church was already under construction with Annie's funds when the bishop visited, and he expressed some qualms about accepting the money because of the potential scandal attached to the DuPonts' divorces and remarriage. The situation was resolved when Annie offered to make the donation from the estate of her recently deceased daughter, Mary Rogers Zinn. Mary had died in January 1893 at just age 16. And so for many years, the church had a plaque stating that the church had been rebuilt in Mary's memory. Incidentally, May DuPont also remarried, this time to the man she had wanted to marry before she married William. So it seems that William, May, and Annie each had an unhappy first marriage and a happier second marriage. William and Annie left Elk Point and lived abroad for most of the next decade. Their daughter Marian was born on May 3rd, 1894, during an extended visit back to Delaware. And their son William Jr., was born in England on February 11th, 1896. So here you can see the whole family line going from Patriarch Pierre S. DuPont in brick red to his son and company founder E.I. DuPont in orange, to his son Boss Henry in blue, to his son William Sr. in dark green, to his children Marian in bright red and Willie in light green. Now, 2 issues eventually led the DuPonts to leave England and return to the U.S. William's business dealings and the children's health. Marian later recalled that the family doctor recommended that the children live in a higher place. So William began looking for a country estate in the mountains of Virginia. And this is a letter that William wrote to Annie while he was house hunting and she was still in England. "We went to Lynchburg yesterday, but could not hear of anything nearby. And I thought Redwood, the place you like the picture of, too far away. So we came back here last night. Today we went to see 2 places, one 9 miles and the other 6 from here. But neither Mr. Lenig nor myself liked them. Coming back, we stopped to see Monticello, where Thomas Jefferson used to live, and where my grandfather, E.I., spent much time before he located on the Brandywine. The view from there is superb. It is on the top of a mountain that I sent you a sketch of in my last letter. This afternoon, we are going to Orange, north from here, and so on north again. And then after he signed off, he added a P.S. Monticello is not for sale. So that seemed to be a disappointment. But since William wrote that he was going to Orange that afternoon, it's likely that was the day he first saw Montpelier. Charles Lenig purchased Montpelier as William's agent in 1900. Lenig transferred the property to William in 1901 and supervised an initial round of renovations before the family moved in 1902. Montpelier was the DuPonts' country home. They also had Bellevue Hall on the Brandywine River in Delaware. And later they purchased a 6,500-acre property in Georgia called Altima, which they used as a winter home and a shooting preserve. So now we're going to look at the DuPonts' home life at Montpelier in the early 20th century. We're fortunate to have 15 DuPont family scrapbooks in our collection, and I'm going to share with you a selection of photos from one of those scrapbooks for our next segment. Renovations from 1900 to 1908 more than doubled the size of the house, bringing it to a total of 55 rooms. So they added a floor and a half to the side wings. They also added wings onto the rear. And here you can see how the wings were built out from the back, hemming in the original back colonnade. The property was just over 1,200 acres when William bought it. He continued to purchase adjacent land, increasing Montpelier to about 2,300 acres by the 1920s. Marian and Willie were 8 and 6 when they moved to Montpelier in 1902. And Willie doesn't look too much more than 6 in this photo, so this must have been pretty soon after they came to Montpelier. Here's Annie in a fabulous hat with the DuPont's dog Bacchus on the lovely concrete patio. We might not think that concrete was fancy enough for a DuPont home, but in the early 20th century, it was a new and incredibly practical building material, which William embraced wholeheartedly and used quite a bit at Montpelier. And here's Marian and Willie with their dog, Mrs. Blackie. Horses and dogs were a big part of the country life at Montpelier. And that's William Sr. with a couple of the dogs. The DuPonts kept various breeds of dogs at different times, including foxhounds, greyhounds, Scottish deerhounds, Dalmatians, and in Marian's adult years, border terriers. And the country life also included sports such as tennis, riding, shooting, and bowling. In this photo, we have Marian in the left foreground. Annie's behind her. Annie's son, George Zinn, seems to be balancing tennis balls on Willie's head. And then there's some other DuPont cousins. George Zinn was Annie's son from her first marriage and was 11 years older than Marian. He had bachelor quarters on the 3rd floor of Montpelier until he married in 1907. He moved to Gaston Hall, which was completed in 1909, and that's a property adjacent to Montpelier, which Annie bought for him. And here we have Willie and Marian trying out a planter in the garden. There doesn't seem to be much planted in the garden at that point, which suggests that this photo was taken at the beginning of Annie's campaign to reestablish the garden. The Madisons' French gardener, Charles Bizet, had laid out a terrace garden in the 18 teens, but later owners had not kept it up. Annie wrote about the garden as the DuPonts found it. She wrote, "The only path was the earth incline path from the entrance to the foot of the garden. The box hedge was broken and bare at bottom and overgrown on top when we got it. and small terraces had been plowed down. No walk, no path, no tile edging, no grass, no vases, no flowers, just a wilderness of weeds. It has taken 22 years, obviously she's writing this later, it has taken 22 years to get the box in present shape. All of the planting of trees, shrubs, and flowers here, my designs. And you can see the inclined path in the photo here. And if you recognize this spot where Marian and Willie are riding the lions, you can visualize the steps that Annie had put in later. And starting to think that the DuPonts acquired garden ornaments mainly for child storage purposes. Now, equestrian activities were an important part of Marian and Willie's childhood, which she recalled while recording oral history interviews in 1973-74 for a book project. I'm going to quote a lot from those recordings in connection with the next few slides. As Marian recalled, the children started off with Nettie the donkey, which she described as really a pain in the neck. Between it and the governess that didn't know how to drive, it would go out into the middle of the front field and lay down, and none of us could get it up until it was ready to get up. And then it would sit up on its front legs like a dog, and finally put its head down and get in the collar again, and went on. If we were meant to go out for a half-hour drive with Nettie, it might be an hour and a half or 2 hours. My father got annoyed with that when he had to take us one day with it. We got rid of the donkey and went into the ponies. Marian recalled, soon after we came to Montpelier, we were clamoring to have ponies. Father was for it. Mother was a little fussy, talking about how impractical it was, bowed legs and everything. Finally, we got the ponies. I remember going down to the station to see them when they got in, Shetlands and calf crates from Indiana. And here you can see Willie apparently being carried away by one of the ponies. As Marian recalled, an Englishman named Mr. Day would ride with Willie and me when we were young. Marian looks a little older here. This may be one of her later ponies. Marian recalled, Grisette, a gray, was the first pony I really liked. We got her because I got thrown off Barbara so much. The only thing wrong she would do with me was to paw in the stream and gradually let herself down in the water. Out in the middle of the stream, she would paw water up. Everybody said, keep on hitting her. Don't let her do that. She'd settle down right in the water. It was before the time we had the regular riding habit. The bottoms of the white dresses I wore would float off. Turn your skirts loose and come out of there, they'd shout at me. It took me a while to learn to hit Grisette hard enough to make her go on. And here are some ponies that look a little less lively than Grisette. That's Marian on the left and Willie on the right, with an unidentified girl in the center. One of the children's favorite places to play was an area they called Coney Island. As Marian recalled, when we first came down here in 1902, there was a plot of land not far from the house, backed up on the formal garden, with an old pony stable nearby. The family said Willie and I could do anything we wanted with that plot of land. It had a fence around it, a picket fence. We were given all the 10-penny nails we wanted, and a few big nails, a saw and a hammer, leftover bits of boards, and we were turned loose. It was no time before we had a show ring. They'd given us old boards not used in putting up the buildings on the place. There was just one rail, but it made a show ring. You never knew what you'd find in Coney Island, which was what my father called it. One day we'd be building chicken pens in there for the bantams, or maybe I'd be growing things in a little garden, anything that would come up quick. You never knew what you'd find in there on a particular day. We loved Coney Island, really loved it. Willie was the carpenter, and I was the carpenter's helper. He'd say, "Hold up this board, Marian," and I would. He had a knack for building things even then. He would later lay out Delaware Park and be the architect for some of the finest race courses in the world. And I know it started for him right here at Montpelier when we were young, the carpenter and the carpenter's helper playing in Coney Island. And here's the pony barn where Emily's and my offices are. Some more fun in Coney Island. Coney Island backed up to a 19th century bowling alley building that the DuPonts had renovated. And here's the DuPont's carriage house, which is now used for Montpelier Foundation offices. Here's Willie learning to box with William Sr., probably in the carriage house. And that's the carriage house on the left and the power plant on the right. And William Sr. had the power plant built at Montpelier between 1900 and 1915. It was originally powered by steam engines and was converted to coal, oil, or kerosene engines in 1917, 1918. The power plant provided electric power, water, and steam heat for the radiators for the Montpelier Mansion, the carriage house, and the pony barn, until the Virginia Electric Power Company began to provide service between 1928 and 1930. The power plant building was then converted into a carpenter shop and storage shed. Here's a side view of the carriage house and power plant from a different angle, coming down the hill from the back of the lawn. And that's William DuPont's agent, Charles Lenig, on the horse. And although William Sr. never took his father's place at the head of the DuPont Company, he was made a member of the board of directors in 1914, where he remained until a reorganization in 1916. He was involved in other DuPont businesses, though, and became president of the Delaware Trust Company in 1920. Because William often took the train to Delaware, he arranged with the Southern Railway to have a station built at Montpelier, with the understanding that he would pay a percentage of the trainmaster's salary and the station upkeep. The depot was completed in 1910. And now we see that Willie is growing up. And here he is with hounds in Coney Island. Willie had his first pack of foxhounds in 1912. And the bowling alley is just barely visible beyond the fence at the left. A few things to know about Marian's adult life. She was the first woman to win a class in the National Horse Show at Madison Square Garden while riding astride instead of side saddle, although she still rode side saddle in fox hunts and in the country. She also shortened her riding habit, recalling that the long one was, quote, just impossible to walk or do anything in, except when you were on a horse. She had the first Montpelier Horse Show in 1921, which was the precursor to the Orange County Horse Show. And later she had the hunt races, which started in 1929 and were sanctioned by the National Steeplechase Association in 1934. Probably Marian's greatest claim to racing fame was when her horse Battleship was the first American-owned, American-bred horse to win the British Grand National Steeplechase. Marian was married and divorced twice, first to Thomas Somerville and next to Randolph Scott. Yes, if you're a fan of classic Western movies, he's that Randolph Scott. Marian, Thomas, and Randolph were all in the same local social circle. The Somerville family owned Cedar Mountain Farm, 20 miles north of Montpelier. Randolph was born in Orange County and attended Woodbury Forest School. And he was actually the best man at Thomas and Marian's wedding. Randolph Scott eventually appeared in over 100 films, 60 of which were Westerns. He usually played the quintessential strong, silent Western lawman hero. And he had the public persona of the Virginia gentleman. His movie career was just starting when he married Marian, and that seems to have been at least part of the reason for their divorce. Now, Annie had died in 1926 and William Sr. in 1928. William Sr.'s will left Montpelier to Marian, with the stipulation that it went next to her children, and if she had no children, it went to Willie and then to his children. For the most part, Marian kept Montpelier as her parents had it. The Red Room was her only major interior change, an Art Deco style room that featured her racing trophies and photos of her horses. She added numerous barns to the property as her horse breeding and training activities increased. And Marian had a lot of philanthropic activities centered on horses, not surprisingly. She gave $4 million to a Virginia, Maryland Regional College of Veterinary Medicine to establish an equine research hospital, which is now Virginia Tech's Marian DuPont Scott Equine Medical Center in Leesburg. She left 1,200 volumes plus an endowment to the UVA Special Collections for what is now the Marian DuPont Scott Sporting Collection. And she also left other of her sporting books to the National Sporting Library in Middleburg. Marian died in 1983, and she did not have the ability to bequeath Montpelier because her father's will already determined the next owners. She had no children, and her brother Willie had died in 1965, so Montpelier would go to Willie's children. In her will, Marian expressed a wish that they would turn Montpelier over to an organization that would preserve it. And she wrote, "The property known as Montpelier was formerly the home of James Madison, the President of the United States, and it is appropriate that it be owned by an organization which will restore the mansion house in such a manner as to conform as nearly as possible with the architectural pattern which existed when said property was owned and occupied by President Madison. It is likewise appropriate that the mansion house be furnished with furniture and furnishings formerly owned by James Madison, or to the extent that such is not possible, with furniture and furnishings of the period of James Madison." In 1984, Marian's nieces and nephews transferred ownership of Montpelier to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The trust still owns Montpelier, and the Montpelier Foundation was created to take care of the preservation and day-to-day operation of the site. Now, people often ask us how the Montpelier DuPonts are connected to other people in other branches of the family. So we'll look at a few examples in this next segment. So how is William DuPont Sr., in the green block there, how is he related to the DuPonts who owned Winterthur? So the short answer is that William's nephew, Henry Francis DuPont, in the pink square, developed Winterthur into a museum of the decorative arts. The Winterthur house had been built by William's uncle, Jacques-Antoine Biederman, the son-in-law of E.I. DuPont, who was married to Evelina, and their block is in orange there. Biederman sold the house to William's father, Henry, blue block, who passed it to William's older brother, Henry Algernon, eggshell-colored block, who passed it to his son, Henry Francis. Then how is William related to the DuPonts of Longwood Gardens? So William's cousin, P.S. DuPont, bought Longwood for a residence in 1906. So that is P.S. in light green. He's the son of Lamont, who was the head of Rapano, who was killed in the nitroglycerin explosion. The Longwood estate already had a well-established arboretum, and PS developed it further and established the Longwood Foundation in 1937 to preserve Longwood gardens for public enjoyment. Then how is William related to the DuPont of DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C.? So DuPont Circle is named for William's first cousin once removed, Admiral Samuel Francis DuPont. So he is in the light blue square over there. Samuel's naval career was launched in 1815 when his father, Victor Marie DuPont, requested a midshipman's position for Samuel by writing to the current president, James Madison. And finally, how is William related to the DuPont of the Foxcatcher movie? And that was John Eleutheri DuPont, the pale pink block there. He was William's grandson and the youngest son of Willie. So William Sr. there in the dark green, Willie in the spring green. If you've seen the movie or if you followed the story when it was in the news, John was convicted of the 1996 shooting of Olympic wrestler and coach Dave Schultz. John had trained as an Olympic athlete in his youth and later turned his mother's estate into an Olympic training facility called Foxcatcher Farm, where Schultz lived and worked. During the trial, John was described as having paranoid schizophrenia, and the verdict for third-degree murder was guilty but mentally ill. And third-degree murder indicates a lack of intent to kill. After 13 years in prison, John died of natural causes in 2010 at the age of 72. And now we've reached the final segment. I've alluded already to a few crossovers in the Madison DuPont stories, but now we'll look at several in more detail. Now, James Madison knew Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, the patriarch of the DuPont family in America. There are 20 surviving letters between James and Pierre dating from 1802 to 1816. Pierre sent books to James, congratulated him on his election and re-election as president, and offered advice during the War of 1812. Oddly enough, Pierre never wrote to ask whether his great-grandson could live in James's house, a slight oversight. So the 1813 letter shown here begins by telling James that no native-born American took more interest in James's re-election as president than the half-American DuPont de Nemours. And there are 6 known letters between James Madison and Pierre's son, E.I. DuPont. Some of the letters discuss E.I.'s gunpowder production. Some discuss how to get letters back and forth to his father in France. In this 1811 letter, E.I. is appreciative of James's offer to send letters to France on a U.S. vessel. We also know of one letter from E.I.'s brother Victor DuPont to James in 1815, asking for a position for Victor's son Samuel Francis as a midshipman in the Navy. As I mentioned earlier, James gave Samuel Francis the position, and without that start, Samuel Francis DuPont may never have made it to admiral, and DuPont Circle in D.C. might be named for someone else. You may have seen Dolly Madison's engagement ring in the Grills Gallery at the Visitor Center, but you may not know the story of how it came to us at Montpelier. The ring descended to Dolly's niece, Annie Payne Costin, then to her daughter, Mary Costin Kunkel. In 1918, Mary Kunkel wanted to sell the ring as well as a clock, writing to Annie DuPont, quote, "Among my few treasures left is an odd little finger ring, cluster of diamonds of odd design, the engagement token given Dolly P. Todd by her future and second husband, James Madison. This ring Mrs. Madison wore always and died with it upon her hand. Removed and always worn by her adopted daughter or niece, my late mother, and since then by myself. I had it on my memorable visit to Montpelier, and I am offering this to you. And why? Dear Mrs. DuPont, I am getting on in years, and money is so necessary that I prefer to dispose of this and know where it goes. It would be a joy to me to know it is yours and at Montpelier. Earlier in the letter, Mary referred to herself as Annie's new old acquaintance. According to a statement Annie later wrote, they met when Mary requested to visit Montpelier. Annie described Mary as very nice and interesting. Annie had admired the ring when Mary wore it to Montpelier, which probably led Mary to offer the ring to Annie. And incidentally, Mary began this October 1918 letter by hoping Annie was well and, quote, that this epidemic has not visited you or yours. So referring to the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. And Mary wrote a follow-up letter describing the ring, quote, the ring is a little finger, round setting, in silver, about 8 stones, and the ring genuine gold, to hold same, also the ring itself. Diamonds in those days were not so beautiful as they are now, but it is the precious relic that makes it worthwhile, and it is quite brilliant. I, of course, feel an attachment akin to sacredness about it, but that is natural, and few would have patience with just sentiment. You, however, I deem look upon it with not indifferent appreciation. You who are so closely walking in the very footsteps of its former owner. And the garnishing of beautiful Montpelier is due to your refined and elegant taste. It would give the dear Dolly the same pleasant satisfaction which I enjoy, in the knowledge that you are there and doing just what she would have done had she sojourned in these latter days. If you make of me the purchase, I want you to fully enjoy it. It has been treasured by me ever since my little girlhood. I was very young when I obtained the permission of my guardian to be permitted to wear it, and I am not sweet 16 now. Annie did purchase the ring, writing, quote, I am glad to have it, and will take great care of it, and will keep it as a souvenir of Dolly Madison. So Annie left the ring to her daughter Marian, who left it to the National Trust. And Marian was also the recipient of some other Madison items that had once been at Montpelier. In 1945, a New York antiques dealer sent Marian a set of 8 cups and saucers, which Mary Kunkel had sold in 1899 with an affidavit stating that they had belonged to Dolly Madison. The set descended in the purchaser's family, and when the dealer acquired it, he wrote to Marian that he was sending the cups and saucers, quote, with my compliments, as I feel they ought to be back at Montpelier. Little did Dolly imagine that her ring and her cups and saucers would return to Montpelier when it was owned by the great-grandson or the great-great-granddaughter of one of her husband's friends. The story of these objects seems like a fitting place to end this presentation on the chemistry between the DuPonts, the Madisons, and Montpelier. And I hope you've enjoyed learning more about their intertwined history. I think you can spot one of the cups and saucers there on the writing table. And the rest of them are there on the bottom shelf on the right in the pantry. So an inspirational view from Montpelier to close out. And I think we have a few minutes left for questions. So let me stop sharing and see if we have any questions. Okay, Brad wanted to know, did others, perhaps Orange residents, use the train station, or was it only for DuPont family members? It was definitely used by the whole community. So it was created for the benefit of the DuPonts, but serviced the whole community. Do you have any other questions? Were there any enslaved people remained at Montpelier over the years? So the enslaved community at Montpelier pretty much was broken into different segments at the time of Dolly's widowhood, so after James Madison died. So some of the enslaved people went with her to Washington, D.C. Some stayed at John Payne Todd's house, Toddsworth in Orange. Some people were sold individually, but there was a group of enslaved people who were sold to the new owner, Henry Moncure, the new owner of Montpelier. So it's possible that some of them and perhaps some of their descendants stayed at Montpelier up until the time of the Civil War. And then at that point, when people were emancipated, some of the formerly enslaved people stayed in the area. So, for example, George Gilmore, who was enslaved at Montpelier, ends up building a cabin basically across the street from what is the main entrance today. It was not the main entrance at the time, but he built a cabin across the street from Montpelier. So there were definitely people who stayed in the area, formed communities like Jacksontown and some of the other communities of freed people in Orange County. Good question. Any other questions? How did Marian DuPont Scott decide on the National Trust as a proper trustee of Montpelier? That is a good question to which I do not have an answer. And she apparently did not even share with the trust that this was her intention. So when she died and when her will became public record, it was a big surprise to the National Trust. So I don't know specifically why she chose the National Trust. It was well established. It owned other historic properties across the country, so she may have chosen it just by familiarity with the work it was already doing. Okay, well, that took us right up to 8 o'clock on the dot. And thank you all so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope it sparked your curiosity to know a bit more about all the different people who lived here at Montpelier.